Yes, absolutely. So my name is Patrick Haack. I'm a professor of strategy and responsible management at HEC Lausanne, the Faculty of Business and Economics of the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. I'm also the director of the HEC Research Center for Grand Challenges, which is a center at our faculty focused on sustainability, providing a platform for colleagues discussing sustainability topics. My research interests are partly in organizational management theory. I also have an interest in social evaluations, practice adoption, and decoupling. This is very much path dependent. So my background is actually in political science. And back then I studied foreign policy and foreign policy interventions. And one of my research areas was trying to understand how foreign policy interventions in Germany get legitimized. So I looked at public discourse, looked at the different frames that were mobilized, and also tested then these frames experimentally to see which frame is more effective to increase approval of foreign policy interventions. So that was my master degree. Then I moved to the industry for a year. And then I saw there's a PhD position open at the University of Zurich with a focus on legitimacy in global governance, which was very nice for me because, of course, I was not a trained management scholar. But this position allowed me to integrate my expertise on international organizations and foreign policy and governance with, well, a more management-oriented focus. And given that this project was focused on legitimacy, I had to learn more about legitimacy. And I found out, well, in institutional theory, legitimacy is a very important concept, but it's very much macro level oriented, right? And there was a lack of micro level research, essentially a lacking focus on the underlying psychology of legitimacy at the collective level. So that's why I started to work on legitimacy, and I guess one answer to your question is, of course, well, it was path dependent. I had to do it because it was a project. But eventually I really got interested in the topic and the concept, because the concept is so rich. You can explain so many things with legitimacy, because legitimacy also explains why organizations are successful, why companies grow and get resources. It also explains stability of the institutional order. So it's a beautiful concept because you can explain many things with it. That's an excellent question. Many people, of course, know very well the work of Mark Suchman, seminal paper published in the Academy of Management Review in 1995. And this paper defined legitimacy as a generalized perception of appropriateness residing at the collective level, right? And Suchman is very explicit by saying, well, this collective level conception is very much independent from an individual observer. So in a sense, the status quo back then when I started my PhD was legitimacy is really at the macro level. And there was not so much on the micro level. A few people started to work on the micro level, like people like Alex Betetkin or Leigh Tost, looking at how individuals make their legitimacy judgments. But there was really no work integrating both perspectives, right? The more macro level perspective advanced by Suchman and the new emerging perspective on the micro level, right? And I think there was like a research gap, and that's the reason why some people, including myself, started to advance a multi-level perspective. And it's also very much consistent with the Micro Foundations agenda, which is essentially about trying to explain variance or heterogeneity at the macro level by looking at the mechanisms, the processes at the micro level, right? So in a sense, a macro level focus is maybe useful to predict outcomes, right? You can predict them, but we struggle really to understand and to explain what are the processes, patterns, or mechanisms leading to a certain outcome at the macro level, right? And I think that's why it's so useful to think of legitimacy or any other social evaluation in terms of a social system, essentially, a social system that is nested, right? You have actors, entities operating at the macro level, but at the same time, you also have actors and dynamics at the more micro level, right? And it's not sufficient to look either at the macro or micro level, but it's more holistic. It gives you more in terms of explanation to look at both levels and how they interact over time. Yes, absolutely. So validity refers to basically Suchman's conception of legitimacy. Legitimacy residing at the collective level, representing a generalized perception of appropriateness. And this understanding really relates to the group as a whole, right? To a social reference group. Could be a team, could be an organization, could be a society as a whole, right? And it very much reflects facticity, right? Something is largely taken for granted and collectively approved. This is validity, right? Propriety, in turn, is more micro-level focused. It's about what an individual evaluator considers appropriate for him or herself, right? So essentially, propriety is about whether I, as an evaluator, endorse a legitimacy object, whereas validity is very much removed from an individual evaluator, but refers more to this collective level perception of appropriateness. Very importantly, validity enters the cognition and sense-making interpretation of individuals in the form of so-called validity cues, right? Two types of cues stemming from authorities and cues stemming from peers, leading to endorsement. And these cues are then used by individuals to form a so-called validity belief, which is different from validity because a validity belief is a second individual level judgment, whereas propriety is about a personal belief. A validity belief refers to an individual's belief what other people believe in a social reference group. Finally, we have consensus. I know in my own work, we define consensus as a meso-level concept, but I'm not sure it was a good idea because I do think consensus and validity actually rely on the same reference group. So essentially, it could be argued validity and consensus very often, or even typically, are located at the same level. Consensus is defined as the degree to which evaluators agree in terms of propriety beliefs, right? So it refers to the distribution of propriety beliefs in a certain social reference group. It could be uniformly distributed, but it could be also bimodal distribution. And then it becomes interesting because we know if, and now getting back to the second part of your question, if, for instance, propriety beliefs and validity beliefs are not consistent, evaluators tend to silence their propriety beliefs out of fear of social sanctions, for instance. If if consensus and validity are not consistent, this could mean that there's a collective misperception in a social system, meaning even though there's this appearance that the legitimacy object, like a practice organization, is collectively endorsed and supported, if the underlying agreement, like the consensus, is hidden and masked, it's not clear how many people actually agree, and potentially there's a large degree of disagreement, this means the perception of validity is a wrong perception because it is not supported by the actual distribution in terms of propriety beliefs, which essentially means a social system is inherently fragile. Whenever this gap between consensus and validity becomes visible, people might actually then start changing their judgments, update their judgments. They might be more willing to disclose their silenced judgments. And this may lead then to protest behaviors, potentially leading to institutional change, which is very sudden and unanticipated because the actual level of support was hidden under this generalized perception of validity. Yes, absolutely. So today I'm going to present a paper on how an exogenous shock shapes propriety belief formation. And in that paper, together with colleagues Jos Steveke and Malekifar, we argue, well, the impact of the shock is very much dependent on two collective level concepts, namely the one I just mentioned, validity and consensus. And we see that the variance in the change of propriety beliefs is very much contingent on those two collective level concepts. In another project with a colleague of Anna Yazinenko, we study deliberations about business regulation. Deliberation meaning we bring together citizens discussing the controversial topic of business regulation in Switzerland. And what we do in these groups, we experimentally manipulate the degree of consensus. Right? In some groups, you have people agreeing with business regulation. So everyone says, yes, we need stricter regulation. In other groups, we have people saying, no, we don't want a change to the status quo. We think the current level of regulation is fine. And then maybe more interestingly, or most interestingly, we have mixed groups. Some people agreeing, some people disagreeing. People don't know about the beliefs of others. So only through the process of deliberation and discussion, they come to find out what is the actual consensus. And we measure then what is the impact of deliberation as a function of consensus on propriety beliefs, validity beliefs, and voting intentions. Because we study actually an initiative. As you may know, in Switzerland, people have the possibility to vote publicly on many policy proposals. And in that case, we looked at the so-called Responsible Business Initiative, and we measured what was the voting intention of people after these deliberations. So that's an ongoing project, and have a couple of other projects. Yeah, I think there's a rich opportunity here to do many things, and I prepared a little list. I do my best to go through the list. I mean, one thing that is really important is to look at the impact of multiple validity cues on propriety beliefs. Typically, what has been done in the past, people have studied the impact of a single validity cue on propriety, like what happens if someone, being an authority figure, endorses a legitimacy object? How does it change the propriety judgment? Or what happens if my peers endorse a legitimacy object? So the focus was very much on a single validity cue. However, of course, we know we're living in an age of complexity and polarization. In reality, we're very much embedded in the context of multiple and conflicting validity cues. However, it's not clear a priori which cue is the most powerful one or dominant one in shaping propriety beliefs. Right? This is definitely a research frontier. Then maybe turning more towards the classical Suchmanian conception of legitimacy. We know Suchman defined different types or dimensions of legitimacy, and other people did as well, but Suchman's proposal is probably the best known proposal in terms of legitimacy dimensions. We don't know so much about what happens, again, in the context of multiple legitimacy types or dimensions. For instance, if a certain practice improves a company's, let's say, pragmatic legitimacy, however, it raises issues with the company's moral legitimacy. So what happens, what's the impact on overall legitimacy, right? So do we see some compensation effects? Are people willing to forget or discount their moral legitimacy judgment because they see a certain company or corporate practice gives a lot of personal benefit? So it's very strong in terms of pragmatic legitimacy. That's not clear, right? So that's also an interesting avenue, I guess, for future research. Many other topics. We kind of have two different conceptions of legitimacy right now in the literature. The traditional conception offered by Mark Suchman, and then the new multi-level conception, very much focused on propriety and validity. It's not clear yet how propriety and validity map onto the Suchmanian dimensions, right? So is there a thing such as validity and propriety for, let's say, pragmatic legitimacy? Is there a validity and propriety component for cognitive legitimacy? What about moral legitimacy? So here again, there's an opportunity to bring those two influential frameworks together and trying to integrate them. Maybe they can't be integrated, maybe it's not useful, but at least it's worth a try. A very important question is the topic of measurement. I think we have seen quite some interesting contributions in the past decades in terms of conceptualizing the multi-level theory of legitimacy. But what we are lacking right now is some empirical work, right? Testing the predictions of the multi-level perspective of legitimacy. And one thing that is really important is the development of a measurement scale that takes into account the fact that people form two types of legitimacy judgments: propriety beliefs and validity beliefs. If we look at the existing measurement scales, also the ones proposed by co-authors of mine, like Alex Betetkin, they do not really distinguish between propriety and validity beliefs. If you look at the items, it's quite a mix, so it's not clear what is actually being measured with these scales. And this is very problematic because we know that the behavioral implications are very different for propriety versus validity beliefs. We know from research that behavior is very much determined by people's validity beliefs, right? What they think other people believes, because they want to conform and they want to comply with normative expectations. So as long as we don't measure and distinguish these two types of judgments systematically, we cannot make any predictions, in my view, about actual behavioral implications, right? From that, it follows also we should not only measure judgments or beliefs, we must also measure behaviors, right? So it's not clear. It's often claimed that legitimacy leads to support, right? So if something is perceived as legitimate, people tend to support it, whereas if something like a legitimacy object, such as a company or company practice, is not perceived as legitimate, people would not support or would even oppose the legitimacy object. Makes sense, right? But at least from a multi-level perspective, we have rarely seen any empirical test whether this is actually true, right? Do we see actually a positive relationship between a favorable legitimacy judgment and the behavioral response? So here, I think there's also a research frontier. And let me see on my list. Yeah, final point maybe aggregation, because multi-level theory of legitimacy is essentially also about aggregation, bottom-up aggregation. And so far, we have some conceptual ideas, but in terms of methods, how to do this empirically, how to aggregate, for instance, propriety beliefs into collective level validity, it's not clear. What is the aggregation rule? Is validity actually reflecting an aggregation of past propriety beliefs, or is it rather reflecting an aggregation of past validity beliefs? Or is it maybe a mix of both? Or is it actually reflecting an aggregation of behavior or lack of behavior, right? If we don't see any protest on the streets, we would conclude, well, maybe the government or the state is legitimate. So it's not clear how individual level concepts get aggregated into the collective level concept of legitimacy. And especially methodologically, there's a huge opportunity to do more work. Very good question. And of course, we see a debate on the role or responsibility of researchers. And we see colleagues advocating for social impacts, right? So in a sense, the dependent variable of management scholarship is changing, especially in strategy, for instance. It used to be quite much focused on explaining performance, right? How can we explain why some companies perform better than others? But now, of course, the dependent variable is moving towards sustainability topics, grand challenges, SDGs, and so on. So what is the role management scholars should have in that context? Well, I think given our privileged position, I would agree with those arguing that we have a responsibility to help tackling or addressing grand challenges, which doesn't mean that we should all become activists, right? And it's also a very delicate question. How can this be combined, being a scholar or scientist or researcher and being an activist at the same time, right? So this is maybe not very clear how to deal with those two roles. Should they be separate or not, right? And this also links back to the question of value-free judgments, right? I think we need a probably more nuanced perspective on the role of, let's say, values or normative judgments in our research. I think I would agree that any research question is often driven by, well, personal interest and the way how we were socialized. And then also think the way how we use then in the end stage our research findings is maybe also determined by our values and beliefs. And I think here it would be actually legitimate to help tackle grand challenges by making an active decision. Okay, in the future, I really want to focus a little bit more my research, not so much on, let's say, how to improve performance or profit, maximizing shareholder value, but how can we actually help solving one of the greatest challenges of our time, such as fighting climate change, reducing poverty, reducing the level of inequality, managing the impact of AI on the work environment. So I think it would be good if researchers would make an active decision. Okay, I'm kind of devoting a significant time and energy of my research on these topics, right? So I think there's a responsibility to do that. That's a very important question. I guess several things could be said. I prepared a short list. I guess many of these points I will now make are quite intuitive, but nevertheless, it might help to think about them. So first of all, very important, networking. It's important to go to conferences, to workshops, maybe also to establish a brand for yourself, right? So for what do you want to be known for, right? In my case, I guess I'm now known for the guy working on legitimacy. I think that's fine. But I think the same would be helpful for more junior scholars, right? So by networking, of course, you get to know people, but you can also kind of, in a way, establish your own brand, right? What you stand for. And networking and going to conferences is also important, of course, to gather feedback. But it's also important to gather feedback on your work, but it's also important to get to know the conversations people are having. The research being published today in the journals is is very much about the conversations people had 3 or 4 years ago on these workshops and conferences. And if you go to conferences and workshops today, the conversations people are having now, this is the stuff that will be published in 4 or 5 years. So in order also to get published, it's important to get to know the conversation. What are people talking about? And how can I make a contribution to that conversation, right? And it shouldn't be too radical, right? You shouldn't be too advanced in that conversation, but it should also not just repeat the existing conversation. So ideally, you're maybe just 1 or 2 steps in advance, right? And so that's why I think it's really important to network and to go to workshops and conferences. Also to find your community and to listen to the conversation. Maybe another and related point is also to maybe ensure you stay sane and mentally healthy, is to balance your personal interest in terms of research with the market, right? So what I want to say, if you are interested in a topic but no one else is interested, difficult, right, to get this published, right? On the other hand, I think we must not prostitute ourselves. So we should just not follow blindly the market and do stuff what we think the market is interested in. I think we should also follow our conviction and the things we're interested in, but not to a degree that no one else is interested. So that's what I meant with balancing your personal interest with the market. If you see the market, let's say, is interested in AI, it seems everyone is talking about AI. It's something that is really big. And you're interested in, let's say, something that is not related to AI, but maybe there's a way to combine AI with your pet project or pet topic, right? To make it attractive also to a wider audience, right? So yeah, think about that. There's a need, I guess, to balance these two push and pulling factors. Another point is collaboration with other people. If possible, try to co-author with people that are better than you, and I really mean it, better on at least one dimension, right? And this is also my ambition, right? So when I work with co-authors, including junior scholars or PhD students, my goal is really to work with people who are better than me on certain dimensions, because I want to learn from them, right? And I guess this is also important for junior scholars. You can learn, of course, from more senior scholars, but then with senior scholars, there's sometimes a trade-off because they are experienced typically and they know how to frame a paper maybe, but typically they don't have a lot of time. And then with more junior people, they don't have a portfolio of 20 papers yet, and they maybe just work on 2 or 3 papers, meaning they have more time to contribute to a paper project, right? So that's something to keep in mind, right? So if you work with co-authors, always ask yourself, hey, can I learn from that co-author? Is this a good combination? And yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Another point I want to make is don't be perfectionists, because this could mean that you will never submit your PhD thesis or your PhD papers. At some point, you need to stop reviewing the literature. You need to stop adding another robustness check to your paper, but you need to submit your paper, right? Even if you think or others think it's not perfect. And the good enough rule basically says good enough means 80%, not 100%. And I'm saying this because we know Pareto, etc., the remaining 20% to get to the 100% as are very work intensive. It takes as much work to get to the last 20% as it took to get to the first 80%, right? And I think it's important for junior scholars at some point to stop working for the paper and let the paper work for you by sending it out to the review process, right? Another point I want to make is diversify your portfolio, build a pipeline. Don't have just one paper where you put all your bets on, but have multiple papers, maybe also submitting to different journals, of course, maybe an A journal for the first paper, but we know A journals can be, well, it takes long, or it takes some time. It can be tricky to get an acceptance. Maybe you have a couple of other projects which you could submit to a B journal, just to make sure that close to your graduation, you have at least one paper accepted or published somewhere, because this is always a strong signal to the market, right? That you're able to publish, or that you're able to get an R&R. And if you submit everything to A+ journals, you might struggle actually to get an R&R, and then you can't signal to the market. So yeah, build a pipeline, but also diversify your portfolio. And the final point is making this point because I also editing, reviewing quite a bit, and I found this always very helpful. Try starting reviewing for journals. First, you provide a service, right, to your community. You're giving back to your community because other people probably also going to review your work. So just the right thing to do to also review others people's work. And importantly, through reviewing, you also become a better scholar because it helps you to improve your thinking, and it helps you also to see maybe some strategies authors use or leverage to become successful during the review process. But you might also see some practices or pitfalls you don't want to repeat yourself, right? So final point I want to make, start review for journals. If you don't know how to do it, how to get in touch with the journals, you can email journals saying, hey, I'm an active reader of your journal, and I would be very honored if you would send me a paper being a reviewer, and maybe at some point they would also invite you then to become a member of the board, the editorial board. I know from my editing experience at AMR, AMR has a very nice program called the Bridge Reviewer Program, where you act as a shadow reviewer. So you go through the whole process, you get the paper, you write a review, and the handling editor actually provides feedback on your review. And the editor might also decide that some part of your review is shared with the authors. And after you get the feedback, you will also fill out a self-evaluation form, and then AMR would award you a certificate. There's also a Best Reviewer Award for bridge reviewers, which is granted then during the AOM, which is also very nice because you come to meet all the other bridge reviewers. So that's one example, and I know many other journals have similar programs in place. So do review. Thank you for the opportunity.